We have a number of things to discuss here. Some of the stuff President Trump has been saying, Vice President Vance, and some of the comments from a number of Iranian officials here to kind of get an understanding of what the snapshot is of the current negotiating period. But you have published a piece on Substack here called the Judgment Day, in which, let's see, this is right here, I believe it is, in which you say the MOU is encouraging, but does President Trump fully grasp that the United States has lost its war to subjugate Iran with air and naval power? Does the president realize the U.S. Navy's failure to wrest control of the Strait of Hormuz back from Tehran exposes the limits of U.S. military power concealed from the public view? Well, that is concealed from the public view because there's nobody even recognizing there's limits to our power. What do you mean by that?
You know, the problem when you decide to use military power, there's always a chance that your use of it may not work. And that's why you have to very carefully consider the utility of using it. You know, this is what Marshal Garkov tried to tell the Politburo before Brezhnev and Chernyenko and their friends made the decision to intervene in Afghanistan. He simply said, I don't think it'll work. And it doesn't matter how many troops we deploy. It's the wrong instrument, and the Afghans will resist. And we won't gain anything from it strategically. Well, he was right. And you had a similar problem from the very beginning with the whole Iran war. And, you know, I don't think President Trump ever really wanted to go to war with Iran. I've said that before, and that's because when I spoke to him privately, this is back in 2020, and I said, sir, I think this is April of 2020. I said, sir, I think the Iranians are really quite receptive to the idea of coming to some sort of arrangement, some deal with you. And he said, I agree with you. He said, I don't see any need for a war. He said, absolutely not. I don't agree. I agree with you completely. I think that can be done. And I never saw any interest on his part in a war. I think that when he finally engaged the Iranians, he did so because Netanyahu began the war. And he had tremendous pressure on him inside the United States from Israel's agents, you know, the billionaires that we refer to all the time, to do it. And he did. And of course, I think he was comforted by the false promise that this would be easy, this would not be challenging, that things would fall apart quickly. And, you know, it was not entirely unreasonable to believe that if you're hearing that from the Israelis, because your assumption is they know their way around in that part of the world. Who knows better than they? But at the same time, he didn't receive any solid and competent advice from the people inside his inner circle, because someone should have stood up immediately, preferably the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and said, sir, do not do this. This is catastrophic, and explain the difference between a continental power and a maritime power, and emphasize that we were very limited in what we could do because we couldn't commit any ground forces, and whatever ground forces we committed would be a gesture. There was nothing we could seize that would make any difference to the ultimate outcome. And ultimately, if you're going to ask us to seize the Persian Gulf, control of it, that's not going to happen. They've mastered capabilities that make that an impossibility, but nobody stood up and said it. So I think what we have to understand now is that, well, they made a decision to go ahead and use the military power. It has not worked. We have lost the conflict against Iran. End of discussion. Period. That's the truth. Now, normally under those circumstances, a bright person, a smart person who's embarrassed by the whole thing, as I'm sure we are, would say, let's get out of here. Let's move on, go somewhere else, do something else, but let's not reinforce failure. That's the problem right now. I don't think the president is in a position where he can easily disengage, and we can talk about that. But the bottom line is that the chink in American armor has been identified. Everyone all over the world that previously regarded us as essentially unassailable has now figured out something they should have known, which is we're limited because we are an air and naval power. We're not really a major land power. And the last time we committed major land forces was, you remember, 1990 and 91. At that point, we were already dismantling the Army. We were lucky we still had an Army. There was 780,000 of us. And out of that, you put 300,000 on the ground in the Middle East. Well, that kind of capability no longer exists. It's gone. And at the same time, we're up against a new set of capabilities that didn't exist when we were there. If we had been as under threat at say Al Jabail, where we landed and offloaded, thousands of tanks, guns, and everything else, by precision guided theater ballistic missiles or unmanned systems, we've never gotten off the ground. So everything has changed since 1990 and 91. And now he knows what we can't do. That's something you don't really want to reveal unless you absolutely positively have to. And that's something that I think the chairman of the Joint Chiefs collectively, along with the National Security Advisor and the Vice President, should have all made clear to President Trump. But they didn't. And so now we're in a lot of trouble, I think, as a great power. No great power wants to be revealed as weak. And then you have the bad habit of after you're being revealed as weak, you say, we got to go out to prove we're still the baddest. And then you get into things that you'd rather not. That's what happened to the British. The British were embarrassed during the Boer War. They had to bring in 250,000 troops to suppress 40,000 Boers. And then ultimately they go into World War I. Huge catastrophe that was the beginning of the end for British national power. So we're on the wrong road right now. The question is, can we get off? And that means we got to get out.
And, you speaking of things that have changed. You talked about, obviously we're talking about drones and missile primarily that weren't the case in 1991 when you and I rolled into Kuwait, et cetera. But there's some information out new, and I wonder how this fits into your concerns there. This has been reported by CNN just today, actually, that there is the downed U.S. pilot reported seeing Iranian drones swarm in jellyfish formation. And according to what the article here, the special forces being shot down over Iran in April described a shocking sight before ejecting from his aircraft. Multiple Iranian drones hovering in the air, moving as one in a formation that resembled a jellyfish, according to 4 sources familiar with the situation here. Now, there have been some reports that those were provided to Iran by China. And Gary, if you can roll that B-roll there, China is been publishing here of late openly a lot of their what their drones are designed to do and what they're having these drone swarms, both in air defense and massive attacks on the ground. That would seem to significantly change. If this is not just, like a movie that might be playing here, but something that they're actually going to do, this has been very concerning. And I just had, literally just as we came on the air here, Larry Johnson, our mutual friend here, said that he had pinged some of his sources downrange who have knowledge about that shoot down, and said, yes, that actually scared the heck out of everybody. Has that changed even from the time of the start of this war, what we thought was the way things worked before?
Of course. There's no question about that. And now we don't have the capability to send all of these drones out without any sort of orchestration. In other words, there still has to be a human being somewhere remote from the location who is instructing and orchestrating these things. But what we have learned to do is to have semi-autonomous drones, that is, drones that follow other drones, so that you can fly in these formations now in ways that you couldn't before. And if you launch enough of them, and we know they're relatively inexpensive at this point, you can do a lot of damage to everything for granted. All the instrumentalities that we've had since 1945 are now at risk. The interesting thing is, people out there that are in uniform are saying, well, the safest place to be is, without any armored protection and without any real firepower on the ground as a light infantryman. I can't conceive of any worse place to be, because what this really does is it makes you permanently vulnerable to everything and anything, because you have no fire support. You have no real mobility. You're stuck, and then you get into these arguments about the future of warfare looking like Starship Troopers. Well, that sounds great until you begin to look into the cost of outfitting it and supplying it and sustaining it and providing energy for it and so forth. I think what we have to recognize is that we're in a position now that we haven't seen really since World War I, since we saw the trench lines come to a halt on the Western Front in 1914. And that's what you're effectively seeing today. Everything is being changed because you cannot move successfully to come to grips with your enemy. Again, we should have anticipated some of this because we saw evidence for this in eastern Ukraine, right, Dan? I mean, this is entirely new. What you're pointing out is that over time, it becomes a bigger problem. And this means that you've got to come up with better and better countermeasures. Will we develop any countermeasures? Absolutely. And we already see some countermeasures that the Russians have developed to deal with the Ukrainians. And a lot of that is electronic warfare. And beyond electronic warfare, it's the ability to put a lot of what we used to call flak into the air that allows you to destroy these things. But the bottom line is warfare has fundamentally changed. There's no question about it. And we're not really prepared to fight in this environment. So instead of saying, well, we've got to, we somehow or another, we are ourselves with glory and we've got to go in and administer a devastating blow, forget it. It's not going to happen. Instead, it's time to back up, re-examine everything, reevaluate everything, and change to deal with this new environment. That's going to take time, Dan. It's not something you do overnight.
Yeah, it's not. And it's unfortunately, well, I guess not so much unfortunately, as it would require first an acknowledgement that Judgment Day has arrived so that we can start making those kinds of thoughts. And unfortunately, as you're about to see in some of the comments from some of our leaders, that day has not yet arrived. At least it is not consciously aware. This whole situation right now with trying to get the MOU and get the war over with, of course, is all about financial issues and the potential harm on our economy, which, as President Trump admitted at that G7 conference when he said, hey, if we don't do this, we could end up having a depression because our strategic petroleum reserves had about 4 weeks of time left. I don't know why he said that out loud, but whatever he did. And so now that here we are trying to really negotiate to get this thing done. Now, President Trump, I think it was just yesterday, said from the Oval Office that, hey, things are moving in the right direction. As a matter of fact, oil is now gushing out of the Strait of Hormuz.
We took in more oil yesterday than has ever gone through the Strait. You probably see that. We have an oil gusher. The Strait is totally open. You know that. And we're negotiating. We'll see how that all goes. But we have two things. We have an open strait, and we have a country that will never have a nuclear weapon. Will never, ever have a nuclear weapon.
So there he is trying to, I guess, do what you suggested there, trying to pretend like we're still in the driver's seat and all this stuff. But I mean, we got to look at the fundamentals and the facts because this is just about an hour old, by the way. This is updated information here. The Hormuz flow of 13.1 million barrels again yesterday. 5 million for Iran, 8 million for everybody else, brings the 7-day average to 8.1. And that's less than 50% of what it was before when it was around 20 million barrels a day. So the idea that this was a gusher and some kind of a record is just simply not true. It's just flat out untrue. But here's the thing, though, Doug, I want to point out to our audience here is that these numbers here are big because there have been a whole fleet of tankers just sitting in the Gulf waiting to get out. And now they're being able to go out. But once they leave out, there's not a whole fleet of empty tankers to come in and take its place. So you're going to see a big glut, and it's not that big, but bigger. And then you're going to see it go back down because all these countries also have to restart all their oil production facilities, which has been shut in since this about a month into this war. So we're a long way from having a gusher of oil. But what does that mean in as far as you are concerned?
Well, what it means is that President Trump is continuing to try and manipulate markets, the markets involving oil and petroleum products. And unfortunately, people on Wall Street have listened to this nonsense. The real impact of this war on us has not even struck us yet. That's what people don't understand. We're headed into much worse times ahead than what we've seen in the past. We're going to watch oil regain its former position. I think it'll go to $150 to $200 a barrel. But that's not what Donald Trump wants. And he's figured out that the people on Wall Street are going to listen to him. At some point, physical reality will catch up. And physical reality says exactly what you've outlined. What are the real outcomes of the war, Dan? Deglobalization is number one. In other words, the whole global scheme for the economy has been disrupted and, frankly, dismantled. Supply chain redundancy from just in time to just in case. People are going to start stockpiling everything. You have weaponized choke points. For instance, very few people are aware, but the Turks just announced that they're going to charge 15% more now for anybody who wants to pass through the Bosphorus. Higher food and fuel inflation, slower growth. Recession is now becoming depression, and we're looking at unavoidable famines. No one brings up in the context of the United States fertilizer, but the fertilizer that we don't have now and haven't had for months fails to cultivate crops that won't grow. When those crops don't grow, what does that mean 6 months from now? That means hunger. It means serious problems globally. I personally am delighted with the fact that President Trump has finally said publicly what I and you and I think Larry and many others have said, and that is that we're looking at a depression in most of the world. And instead of just a very serious recession here, could easily become a depression. We haven't even talked about all the problems with bond markets and the shell games that Bessent and others have been playing to keep us afloat. That's all going to fall apart. It's a matter of time until our currency is completely debased and destroyed. All of these things are underway. He's trying to present a happy face, or as I like to say, what I used to say in the military, which is we're putting a happy face on a dead rat. And there's no easy political solution for this. That's the second part of this, which I hope we'll talk about.
We will definitely talk about that as well. One other thing I want to talk about that was as a reference of what Vice President Vance said yesterday, again, trying to paint this picture that we're in control of everything, is the issue of frozen funds. Now, there was this first of all, President Trump himself boxed himself into a corner by just relentlessly demonizing President Obama for, quote, giving away plane loads of cash to Obama, et cetera, which was unfrozen assets from the Iranians at that time, back in 2015. Well, that's the same category that the Iranian side said had to be released up front. Well, they tried to put a good face on that yesterday by the vice president saying, well, hey, don't worry about that because that's all going to be stuff that we get to dictate to them how they're going to use it, and they're going to buy it from American farmers only for use, et cetera, on the place. However, Foreign Ministry spokesman Bagay says, yeah, about that. He said, we find it interesting that the goal of the war, which was announced as the destruction of Iranian civilization, has been reduced to enriching American farmers. And then he said, Iran's frozen funds are accessible so that we can freely use them as needed. Nobody's going to tell them how to use it. What do you make of this disparity, and who's going to be proven right?
Dan, here's a tip. Any experienced diplomat will tell you this. When you are engaged in serious negotiations, you say nothing. If Vance is really the lead diplomat in this particular setting, shut up, go back behind closed doors and negotiate. If you have to come out and make a statement, come out and say, we're making progress and we're optimistic. Thank you very much. And he walks off the stage. It's not necessary for him to cover for the president's imprudent remarks. That's not his job. It's not a problem for him. His job is to deliver a negotiated settlement. So stop talking. All you do when you go public and make the series of statements that he did is exactly what you've just reported. You're negotiating publicly. And so your opponent says, fine, screw you. We're not going to go along with X, Y, and Z. We have completely lost the plot on diplomacy. All good agreements, long-term, with any kind of efficacy, are reached in private, in silence, behind closed doors, not in the public forum.
Man, if only Vice President Vance had gotten that advice yesterday, because there was one other really painful thing that he said, which has also been repudiated, and that is in the issue of the nuclear issue, and especially of inspectors on the ground. Here's what Vice President had to say.
The Iranians have agreed to invite IAEA inspectors back into their country. That is a major milestone for the American people and the first step in permanently ending a nuclear weapons program in Iran. And that's exactly what we wanted to do. That's exactly what we asked to happen. We made a lot of great progress on other nuclear talks.
Now, heading into this, the Iranian side had said, by the way, we're not even, that's the nuclear stuff is phase 2. We won't even talk about that for a while. We got to get these first, I think there's 5 paragraphs that have to do with upfront things. They said that's what we're going to negotiate. After the 18 hours were finished. And about the same time the vice president was making that statement, we had I think it was, it may have been Iraqi, one of the foreign ministry spokesmen at that time said, hey, we both presented our positions on the negotiation. I mean, on the issue of nuclear weapons, but nothing was discussed. We're not even going to negotiate it until later. And then after Vice President Vance said that, then a foreign ministry spokesman, Bagai, said this.
We neither had a meeting with the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, nor do we have any plan for the agency to inspect Iran's nuclear facilities damaged as a result of the US military aggression and the Zionist regime. Fundamentally, there is no procedure in this regard.
So it's just unclear to me, Doug. One is the hope, because you can't make those statements and not know that the Iranian side is going to come out and repudiate them. If that doesn't manifest, then it makes us look even more weak if we don't get the inspectors, like you said there, and if they don't spend the cash the way we claim, then we've come out looking even worse.
Are you suggesting that we're watching a clown show? Because I think that's what we're seeing. This is amateur hour in the worst sense of the word. No one in their right mind, once again, who is interested in any sort of successful negotiation on any of these issues will discuss them publicly until the issues have been resolved. And if I were an Iranian, I would have done exactly what that spokesman did and say, look, we have not agreed to anything. What are you talking about? If this keeps up, and I suspect it will, because I see no evidence that we learn anything from the past, and I see no evidence that we respect experience and understanding, intelligence, let alone our opponents, I don't see anything good happening. I see nothing emerging from these talks whatsoever. No political solution. And every time Vance opens his mouth, the president opens his mouth, they make it less likely that you'll see anything of value emerge.
And then where should we go in here? Because there's still some other, there's a lot of issues on the table that have to be resolved one way or the other, because we've started this process. So what can we do?
Well, this is the issue that I wanted to address in my Substack article and Judgment Day for Trump's War. There is no political solution to extricate us from this quagmire, but there is a military solution, only one, and that is we withdraw. Now, why would we do this? The longer this peace process drags on, the harder and more complex it becomes. Trust has collapsed between both Iran and the United States, something that will take years and possibly decades to repair. And remember, Israel remains absolutely, totally, and completely disinterested in any sort of an arrangement. So this is something the president cannot overcome. I think the president is under duress. For what specifically, I can't explain it, but it's very obvious that he is under duress. And the Jewish lobby, or the Israel, whatever you want to call it collectively, its agents in the United States have got something on him. They're holding him to it, and they're telling him that, he better continue the war. So I think what you witness with Trump from time to time are these outbursts of anger and frustration that have less to do with the Iranians and more to do with the fact that he's trying to reassure the people that put him into the White House, the people that spend hundreds of millions of dollars to get him there to begin with. But at the same time, he's still trying to come out with something that he can call a success. I don't think that's going to happen. So I think what we really need to do to convince the Iranians that we're serious is to withdraw. We've got to dismantle our position in the region. We can tell the Iranians anything we want, but unless they see us leave and a withdrawal that is capable of diffusing the inevitable Israeli bomb that's waiting to go off, the president's got to do some things. First of all, he's got to declare we're going to withdraw, reject the over-reliance on air and naval power and air power for the future, disengage U.S. forces accordingly. We got to cancel defense contracts to rebuild bases in the region. We're not doing that right now. We've got a lot of people lined up who think they're going to make big bucks from rebuilding these things. We've got to remove the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. We've got to remove the Secretary of War. We've got to remove the director of the CIA. If you don't do this, the assumption is, well, nothing's going to change because these are the people that are driving and shaping policy. These are the people that dragged President Trump into war. These are the people who want to keep him fighting. And you have to broker an agreement between the Gulf states and Iran conditioned on our withdrawal. Now, this is something that he doesn't need to necessarily come out and admit right up front. I'm going to remove all these people immediately, although that should happen soon. But he really does need to disengage, get them out, and just tell the Iranians, we're leaving, we're out. Because there's one thing he cannot do, Dan. He cannot deliver Israeli compliance with anything that Iran wants.
Yeah, and we're going to get to that in just a second because that's a much bigger issue than some may realize, like much bigger. But man, let me tell you, the biggest headwind to what you just described there is President Trump himself. This is what he posted on Truth Social here just hours ago. And he goes into this whole thing. And despite protestations and false statements to the contrary, coupled with a drumbeat of fake news, Iran has to try to make the U.S. victory as small and insignificant as possible. Iran has fully and completely agreed to the highest levels of nuclear inspection into the future. Infinity, he writes here, which is just exactly what you suggested, that he's concerned about looking like he's won. So he just continues to say these things that are true. And then it goes down even further. He said, I have agreed to allow the blockade of Strait of Hormuz to open and no need to have a further blockade. However, all ships remaining in place, should it be necessary to reinstate the blockade, I will. And then he gets into the issue of the money and the sanctions that the U.S. Treasury is going to put into escrow, controlled by the USA. And then it'll be used only exclusively for including corn and wheat and soybeans from our great American farmers. But Doug, there's no way that that's going to be true. And it's at some point when that doesn't happen, despite what even the Iranians said here, if they never agree to it, that's obviously going to be not true. Meanwhile, directly connected with that, here is Ghalibaf yesterday, who went to Oman, that they're working on the arrangements for the control of the Strait of Hormuz after this 60-day period is over. Remember, President Trump Truth Socialed out that there will be no fees charged for 60 days, and there will be no fees charged after 60 days. And the Iranian side has said, we will charge them on the day 61, and they're making progress right now. And that is authorized in the memorandum President Trump signed. Man, with those headwinds, I don't know how anything is going to work out right here.
Well, President Trump has something that all of his opponents don't. And that is the American people in overwhelming numbers are utterly opposed to the war. And the numbers of people opposed to the war have risen to the point that we have not seen since Vietnam. In fact, this war now has even less support than the war in Vietnam did at its end. Now stop and consider that. So what is holding back the president? You know, Abraham Lincoln said something that people didn't understand until he's put it into action during the Civil War. He said, with public sentiment, everything's possible. Without public sentiment, nothing is possible. Well, right now, all of the people, whether it's Lindsey Graham or Tom Cotton or Chuck Schumer or whoever else on the Hill is, picking up their checks from AIPAC and saying, go do this, bomb them into the Stone Age. They have no support from the American people. President Trump, if he stands up and says, that's it, we're out, I'm leaving, he has support. The American people will support that. That's what the American people want. So I fail to see what President Trump's problem is. And as we discussed at the beginning, the longer he stays, the greater the likelihood that something else will happen, that we could be dragged back into this losing proposition by the Israelis, and we end up losing more and looking even more feckless and incapable. It's time to get out. Stop this nonsense.